Hey everyone, this is Chris Murdock. This is Recruiting Connections with me, Chris Murdock, where we talk about all things connections. And today's guest is Kris Clelland. Chris, please introduce yourself and then we'll just jump right into it.
Hey, Chris, and hey, everyone. Yeah, to give a very brief introduction, I'm Chris. I've been in and around the talent traps in predominantly IT for just over 2 decades, which gives away my age a little bit. I'm currently in Sydney. I've been in Australia for just over 10 years. My 10-year anniversary was on January the 1st of this year. Originally, clearly not from Australia with my accent. I'm originally from Scotland. Yeah, I've been in and around the tech markets, pre-sales, technical solutions, sales management, and my last decade has been leadership within TA for various sizes and scopes of organizations across the globe. Little bit on me.
That's awesome. We're just going to jump right in. Connections. What does it mean to you?
Yeah, so I'm probably not going to go down the tech route, albeit my current organization is advisory and consulting, including TA and HR tech. I'm not going to take the connection as a physical or a technical connection. I also do a lot of advisory work in the diversity, equity, and inclusion arena. So connection to me, and I had no idea that this was going to be around solely the word connection. So you've caught me off guard, but that's probably better that I didn't get the chance to think about it. I'm a bit of an overthinker, so I would have come with pages of stuff. Connection to me is probably the physical connection, but from a person to person perspective. The inclusion and belonging side is what comes to mind in my head when the word connection comes up. A lot of organizations don't make that connection, pun intended, when it comes to the organization to the people. And that can stream through a number of things, which again, I cover in my own practice with my own business, is making that connection on an internal standpoint by building out a sustainable employee value proposition, treating your staff correctly, but then also being completely and utterly transparent and honest to the external world about what that EVP means internally, but to an external audience. So that the word connection to me is about the people. It's the main reason that I join any organization, or I have joined any organization, and it's the reason why I do what I do today.
It's the reasons why everyone joins a company. The diversity side really kind of comes into play at the recruiting before they're an employee. The equity makes sure that once they're an employee, they have an equal footing as everyone else. But the inclusion and the belonging, that's a little bit harder. There's a lot more nuance because you now have the international side of things and the working remotely. When your clients come to you and ask you to help with the inclusion and the belonging, how do you manage that from an international standpoint? Because I mean, everyone's dispersed throughout the globe more often than not. Most people think of it in terms of remote from within a city or working from within an office. You have a unique perspective from the international side of things. What are some of the things that companies should think about? And what are some of the things that you do to help your clients be inclusive and create belonging internationally?
Yeah, great question. I'll also maybe challenge one of your points as well, Chris. I don't believe that the equity side is just giving people a fair chance once they're through the door. I think it's also about giving them a fair chance before they get through the door. There's so many tech vendors across the globe, and I partner with a bunch of them that make the process prior to stepping through the door fair and equitable. So I'll challenge your thinking just a tiny bit.
We'll come back to that towards the end because I actually like that. You're the first person actually to bring that up. And so this is fascinating, but we'll come back to that. I made a note,
Okay.
but let's talk about the international side.
International inclusion and belonging side for me, it isn't something that I don't think a lot of organizations are not doing. I just don't think there's a true focus on it. And it can be simple little things with inclusion, like creating employee resource groups or ERGs, whatever you want to call them, and making sure that underrepresented groups, people of color, disability, etc., have the chance to voice their frustrations, the positives, the negatives to like-minded people. And I'm not saying like-minded people that, for example, PWD hires or people with disability hires should only be in an ERG group with other PWD people, because I think that's completely wrong. That's the opposite of inclusion. But it gives people the platform to at least speak with people who are going through the same things, who have the same frustrations, who have the same discrimination in the external world, etc., and voice their opinion just a little bit more than they perhaps would in a group full of people like you and I, like middle-aged, white, privileged male society. And I think that is important. And a lot of organizations try to create those groups, but I don't think they do it amazingly well. They don't put a focus on it, so people have to search and don't know where to find it. I think as part of any onboarding process or induction, you should be introduced to the networking groups and the groups that you have internally within your organization. And also, if your organization is small, I know plenty of organizations that are sub 500 people that have got people all over the globe, not just the country. And I know the US is a big enough country, but anywhere else outside of the US, they've got teams everywhere. And it's also creating the networking groups externally. So introducing them to saying, hey, we're actually affiliated with these 5 networking groups. Why don't you join? Because there'll be people that you'll get to collaborate with. And as long as you're not giving away IP for the organization, but et cetera, et cetera. And a lot of businesses, in my opinion, don't do it well. And then on the belonging piece, I think it's then a continuation of that. It's an enhancement of a strategy to bring in people or to evolve teams internally that focus solely on these things. And a lot of people just think, oh, we'll just give it to HR, we'll just give it to TA, because that's who should deal with it. And that in itself is anti-inclusion and anti-belonging by presuming that it's the stereotypical departments. Inclusion and belonging is everyone's responsibility. It should be from C-level all the way through to everyone that sits at the bottom of the hierarchical tree.
Absolutely. And I think one of the interesting things that you kind of bring up that comes to mind, giving everybody a voice and a platform to be heard. Not everyone is willing to stand up and say something. Something that we've been seeing is forums on Slack to be heard, because not everybody is comfortable raising their hand during an all hands, but giving people multiple avenues. So the introverts versus the extroverts. And then as simple as, if you're going to have a happy hour, make sure that you're having your happy hour at a time that the parents are able to attend. I mean, that's how much inclusion really matters, because if you keep having all your happy hours at 5 or 5:30, most of the people that have to go get their kids are gone. So you got to, those types of things you got to think about. Now, when it comes to the belonging, when you have multiple countries represented, how do you define the individual cultures, and how do you help get those kind of integrated, or at least on a somewhat level playing field to where one's not dominating another?
Yeah, my next point before you spoke there was actually going to be on cross-cultural training and cross-cultural sort of methodologies. And I think that is an important one. For me, it's taking things back to basics. Even the largest organizations in the globe have to consistently audit themselves and do surveys throughout the organization to make sure that their inclusion, their cultural, their racial, the diversity in the organization is kept up to date. I was with AWS, luckily, under Uncle Jeff for a couple of years with absolutely no red tape around the purse strings, which I don't think I'll ever get that opportunity again. But it was little things like that. Like, I was one of the first male members to be a champion and a chair for women at Amazon. And the local chair here in Asia Pacific used to love that, Chris, you're introducing most of our events from the front stage, and people kind of look at you funny. And I said, I like that, because why should it only be women that are advocating for women? Why should it only be racial ethnicities that are advocating for themselves? Why should it only be disability advocating for the others? And on that cultural piece, that's an important factor for me, is that every single person in the organisation or out with the organisation should be advocating for every diverse group. That was a driver for me setting up my own business, with the key pillar being DE&I. And not a lot of people recognised me for diversity, equity and inclusion, because most of the world haven't been on the inside, above, below, beside me in an organisation to see what I've managed to drive with regards to that respect. And if you look at me on paper, I fall into none of the 15 plus diversity categories. And I mean that wholeheartedly. I don't fall under any of them. But why should that be a reason? I spoke to Torrin Ellis, for those in the US who know Torrin, before Christmas, and he said that. He said, Chris, I think you're more of a champion than I am, because you fall under zero of the categories, and I'm out in the community pushing for Black equality because I've been through it personally. He said, the fact that you've not been through any of these, but you're still trying to push it. So the cultural side for me doesn't just fall onto one department or one demographic, etc. And it often falls on deaf ears. I think everyone should be an advocate for trying to drive the cultural side. And it can be simple things. It can be providing cross-cultural training and education that individuals can sort of develop a better understanding of different cultures and their norms, their beliefs, their values, which can also help reduce misunderstanding and conflict and promote a little bit more of a sense of belonging for everyone right across the cultural spectrum. And there's a whole heap of things that can be done, but for me, the first thing should be an audit. Every organisation should do a quick audit. It doesn't have to be 6 months long, to get to the crux of where are the gaps and what do we need to do to fix them.
And when you're doing the audits, what are the questions that are being asked of each division or office?
I mean, if you go to an HR department would stereotypically have most of the diversity metrics that are needed in an organisation, but it's usually ground level. So they'll generally have the age demographics of an organisation, the racial mix, but a lot of the racial mix people don't answer the questions, and you've got no right to have to answer the question. But then you've got everything else on the side. You've got age, sex, gender, ethnicity, education, race, nuances, disability, neurodiversity. And a lot of organisations also leave, which I've just done there quite badly, they leave the neurodiversity piece to last because they think it's the most difficult to challenge. And I didn't leave that to last purposefully there. But the types of questions that should be asked is what age bracket do you fall into, not what is your date of birth. And if you were to align with an ethnic background, which one of these 50 would you associate with? And there's always got to be options for prefer not to answer or other, because a lot of cultures have multiple cultures within it that's not seen as the overarching umbrella of ethnicity. And I think then either bringing in an MIS analyst, bringing in a consultant or an advisory business like us, just to have a look at the gaps from a real world perspective. The thing that I quite like about what I do now in the advisory piece is that I was a practitioner for 20 years, so I understand the pain points of what someone is looking for. So I can give maybe a little bit more of a personal depiction to say, hey, here's kind of what you should be looking at. And I never tell people what to do because my advisory and my engagements are always a collaboration, and it has to be the organisation taking things to the next level with as minimal help from me as possible. So yeah, I mean, you could ask a whole multitude of questions, and I'm sure what I've said is not rocket science to anyone that's listening.
But sometimes people are too close to it. Companies can be,
Yep.
They don't always know what their biases are. They don't know what exists, what biases exist from department to department. And so having an independent person come in can actually be that mirror that a lot of these companies need. A lot of the issues that companies run into, and my friends in TA run into in HR, there's not usually buy-in at the top unless you have data. You've got to have data to show where the gaps are, show what can be done, and then start connecting those dots. Like, you do this really, really well. This here needs some work, and this is non-existent and needed. But sometimes it takes an independent eye to do that. How often do you get pushback once you actually do one of these audits? How often?
Quite a lot. The reason that I often get pushback is that a lot of organisations make the mistake with a diversity survey internally to find out the crux of their demographics and what the splits are. They forget to leave out, so most of them would only go down the demographic route with regards to age, gender, ethnicity, sexual orientation, etc. A lot of organisations kind of forget about the inclusion and belonging. So asking their employee base whether employees and themselves feel valued in the workplace, whether they feel like they belong, and then they don't go into discrimination and bias. And when I bring that sort of stuff up, most, I won't say all, but most C-suite or most senior teams would say, oh, we can't ask that. And my response is, why wouldn't you ask that? Is that because you're too scared of the answers that you'll get back? And ultimately, the quick and short answer is usually yes. But until you know what's going right and wrong in an organization, and it's not always just wrong, because a lot of C-suites, a lot of boardrooms are often shocked positively by, oh my goodness, I didn't realize we had so much of that type of person in the organization, or so much of that race, or so much of whatever. So quite often it's a light bulb moment, but a lot of organizations are too scared to see the data in black and white. And that really is a shame, because until you see the data, like, I'm a hugely data-driven person. Even, like, no offense here if my wife's listening, if she can hear me from downstairs, but even when I have an argument with my wife, I go in with data just to make sure that it's an informed argument and it's not just my personal emotions. And that's where, even though I'm personally super passionate about this area, and I don't think I'll ever stop being. Someone said to me the other day, at what point will diversity stop? And I said, probably when I'm in the ground. That's what point it will stop for me. But then hopefully I've educated the next generation and the generation after to continue that to another exponential level. And that personal thing, I have to often try to remove the personal from the professional when I'm doing things like this, because you're doing it for the better of an organization. But the pushback, 100% is real. Like, the pushback is constant. I don't want to see that data because I'm scared of what the outcome will be. Well, until we see the data, I can't show you how we could possibly evolve it. I can't tell you what stage in the life cycle we're at and how you get to the next level. And that's another thing that we'll be releasing very soon, is a bunch of maturity matrices, which I've not seen anyone in the globe do these yet to the level that we've done them. You see maturity models all the time, which give you a rough indication of where you are. Our maturity matrix that will be released very soon will also show you who you need to have on board and how you need to take things to the next level of that maturity. And the reason for that is my last 12 months of doing things like this with organizations. Fundamentally, at least with a maturity matrix, I can show them, look, there are organizations that are at advanced or optimized level across people and teams, across tech and data, and across strategy and policies or processes for every level of the cycle of diversity, of EVP, of employer and talent branding, of workforce planning, of workforce analytics, of people analytics, of talent management, etc. Yeah, the pushback, Chris, is 100% real, and I laugh at it because I'm super honest. I don't sugarcoat many things, which 99% of people love and 1% of people hate, and I'm okay with the 1% that can't take the honesty because they probably don't need me at that point in their life cycle. But most organizations who are willing to sit down and say, okay, we potentially have an issue, and how do we better it? At least you've taken the first step to put your hand up and say, I need help, or I could benefit from X.
But how do you support this yourself mentally and your clients? Because you're an empathetic person, I can tell.
Yep.
You don't do this without being incredibly empathetic, almost to the point of being an empath, where you actually are feeling people's feelings. One, how do you help your clients through this? Because this can be very emotional and very, very trying, but how do you also handle your own emotions at the same time? Because this is something you're very passionate about.
Yeah, I'll probably tackle the client one first. From a client perspective, I always try to explain, and most organizations will have a data department. They'll have a couple of MIS analysts at the very least, or they'll have data people throughout their organization. And the crux of this is, look, you've put your hand up to ask for help. In order to get help, I can't make emotional decisions to help you based on what I think you're doing right and wrong, because quite often what I think you're doing right and wrong is not what's going on, and what I think will help you might not be at the right stage or life cycle of your organization. So putting data in the mix allows organizations to make informed decisions as opposed to emotional decisions. And that's something that I try to let a lot of people know. Like, the reason I'm following these steps, the reason that your roadmap looks like X, Y, or Z, or the reason that we are building a roadmap around A, B, and C, is because I need to understand fully what's going on in the organization before I end up giving you something that's 3 phases ahead of where you need to be, because it has to be sustainable. A lot of people also think that fixing DE&I is a 4-week program, and I'm like, oh my goodness, even if you're a 10-person organization, it's still a 6-month program for you to continue this. And a lot of organizations, once I do this sort of stuff, will say, hey, can we have you 3, 4, 5 days a week for the next sort of 3 months to help us with this? And I'm not a greedy person in any way, shape, or form. I do what I do to help the many. And I'll often say to organizations, look, I've given you the framework. Try yourself to make some mistakes while trying to evolve this. You don't need me for 3 days a week, because that's revenue that you're spending that you don't need to be spending. How about I come in 1 day every 2 weeks, or maybe 2 days every 3 weeks, if you need me slightly more, like 1.5 days a week, and I'll just help you keep the wheels in motion. I think that emotional piece from a client, I think most have done the right thing by putting their hand up to say that they need help. So the emotional part is quite often not removed, but at least minimized when they've reached out to say, hey, we've got no idea what we're doing for this. Can you potentially help? And I'll go in and I'll do a full diagnostic before I even decide whether a company needs me or not. And I can give organizations free advice that doesn't require spending money with an advisory or a consulting organization like me. As I said, I'm not a greedy person. As long as I'm comfortable with the way that I live, then I don't need to be earning millions, which I, by the way, I'm definitely not. And my wife seems to think I am because I've got my own business and she's seen the bottom line, so she knows I'm not. But yeah, I mean, the emotional side for a client is always just a sit down conversation or a bit of, again, me putting personal advice in and maybe trying to get a client to take the advice that I often don't is remove the personal from the professional. You've reached out for help. Let's look at the data together and make an informed decision with your HR department, with your C-suite, with your marketing department, with your talent heads, with regards to where could we potentially take this. For me personally, I always say to people that I take 100% of myself into work. I've never blown my chest up and put on a persona when I go into work. You get 100% of me, like it or lump it. And as I said, 90+% of people will like it, sub 10% won't, because I take 100% of me, my emotions, my personality. The reason I do what I do is because I'm emotionally invested in the areas that I'm involved in. I've said to people in my own teams, if you don't enjoy what you do, let me help you find another career that you will enjoy. Because if you love what you do, no day is a work day. And I try to stick to that as much as I can. That means that removing my emotions from things like diversity audits, diversity road mapping, creating or implementing policies, procedures, projects, etc., is often a bit of emotion definitely there. But I think from a personal standpoint, if I didn't have the emotion, I would be doing this for revenue and dollars. And that's 100% not the reason I'm doing this. Everyone around me thinks just because you've got like people that have got their own business, oh, well, you must instantly overnight be making rakes of cash. Absolutely not. It's probably the most difficult thing I've ever done in my entire life for the least amount of money in my entire life. I've come away from some pretty nice and secure salaries with additional benefits and superannuation on top and government initiatives thrown into your sat, like all of these things. And I stepped away from that thinking, right, let's give this a red hot go, and just didn't realize just how hard it would be to have your own business. But I think I don't remove 100% of the emotion. I go in with data informed decisions always, but without that personal alignment to what I'm trying to do, I don't think organizations would believe it. And I can't remove the fact that I'm passionate about it. I really can't.
That's the connect. Ultimately, that's how you connect with your clients. They got to know who you are.
Yeah.
And that's always been a big part of my career, not just as an entrepreneur, not just as IQTalent, but before that, it was important for everyone to know who I was and just how much I loved the research and supporting them in their recruitment efforts. And as the DEI aspects of recruitment became more and more front and center, we had always done that. If our clients were putting barriers in place that were going to keep us from having a diverse pipeline, such as, oh, we just want people from the top 10 B schools. That right there, that's just one big glaring lack of diversity from the get-go. So yeah, so we've always had that be at the forefront. But at the same time, though, I applaud you on this effort. And it's absolutely fascinating. All right, I want to circle back to what you said about equity before. So most of the conferences I've gone to, people kind of treat the equity and talk about it in terms of once they're in. So diversity front end, but no, I want to hear this, but I'm just saying that's what I've always heard. It's pretty much how I've been talked to about this. I got to hear this because I think it broke a piece of glass in my brain and it makes total sense. So walk me through.
It's the whole point in diversity as a whole. You mentioned breaking glass. If you're not breaking things, they will never reform or be fixed. And the way that things are historically built, if we take glass, for example, you melt down sand, you mix it with X and it becomes Y. Unless you add something else to the mix, that glass bottle is always going to be the same type of glass, made the same way, from the same background. Unless you throw a piece of glitter into the mix and you throw mud in there or whatever it is to add color and diversity to what that's going to be in the end, things will always be the same. A lot of organizations, when it comes, and I never speak about, I've done quite a lot of programs in the past year on employer branding. I'm from a design engineering background, which is why I got into pre-sales technical solution work, because I loved the mathematics and the engineering side, but I've also always been design oriented. And I've done a lot of EB campaigns over the past 12 months with regards to everything from completely rebuilding people's brands, so creating logos, point of sale, etc., which people are like, wait a minute, you can do that. And I'm like, that's the stuff that brings out my creative juices. I do a lot of artwork, I do a lot of pastel work and charcoal work and painting. Not as much now that in the past decade, which is a shame, and my wife tries to get me to go back to it. But that sort of creative side of, people don't think of that equity piece as right from the very start. How are you branding your organization to attract more diverse talent and more people to be attracted towards your organization? But then they don't take it 3 layers back the way again. And I constantly refer to reverse engineering a process. If you reverse engineer -3 again, even from the talent attraction piece, your diversity has to be forefront of everything that you do externally, but it also has to be transparent. I could name to you right now 5 organizations this week alone that I've seen LinkedIn posts that have went up around the social and corporate responsibility, the factoring in of economical factors for net zero, etc., and also on diversity. I know people in those organizations, and I know 99% of what they say externally is not actually what goes on the inside. And they're still working on those things, but don't put it out as, we've completed this, we are doing this is what we live and breathe, when you actually don't. There has to be a level of transparency from what you're telling your internal staff with an EVP or an employee value proposition to also what you're telling the external market. And as soon as you do that respectfully and honestly and truthfully, and it doesn't matter if you're saying to the external world, hey, we've noticed recently through an audit, and it doesn't have to have Clellands and co against it. It can be, we did a recent internal audit and found out that here are the demographics within our organization, and what we are doing right now to actively try to fix these is why. You're letting the external world know that you're making a conscious effort to fix something that you know is not as perfect as you would like it to be. That's 100% okay. You don't only have to tell people things once they're done, because then you wouldn't be getting that post out for 12 or 18 months, let's be honest. So reverse engineering it again, that talent attraction piece also goes out to your clients, your new partners, your new customers, all of that sort of stuff. And by bringing in equitable partners, I caught up this week with a number of Indigenous vendors with regards to a client operation who want to try and increase their Indigenous community here in Australia, which, for those of you who don't know, the Indigenous community were those who were first on the Australian lands. And I reached out to 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 organizations. And by the way, I'm tapping here on my whiteboard next to me. And I also reached out to the New South Wales, which is where Sydney is, the New South Wales Premier for Indigenous community, if she knew of anyone else that I could potentially be in contact with. As soon as you go 3 or 4 steps further, that equitable piece then becomes not just talent that you're bringing into the organization that you're attracting, but it also then attracts a different caliber of client. Some clients won't even work with you if your diversity isn't forefront of the pillars that you're working on in your organization. And people don't realize that. By opening up diversity, you're not just opening up new people that come into the organization of varied colors or varied races or varied ages or whatever. You're also opening up the doors to multiple new clients, partners, customers, etc. So your bottom line is 100% affected by not having that equitable piece correct. As you said, a lot of people, when they speak on stage, and I've listened over the past decade to, I don't know, 5,000 talks on DEIB and other topics. And I've been around, in the past 12 months, more so I've been around a lot of the large global influencers and analysts like Lily Zhang and Jennifer Brown and Torrin Ellis, etc., listening to them. And I'm a constant learner, by the way. I don't know everything, so I constantly want to learn. But the one thing that I notice most people talking about when they put out a podcast or they put out a segment is that the equitable piece, as you said, because what you've learned about equitable is when someone steps through the door, how do they feel as if they are part of the fabric of the organization? That has to be transparent before someone gets to the organization, because if you're not treating someone equitably before they get there, removing bias in a process. And I always say to teams, don't just hold yourself accountable for your bias. I never tell people to remove bias because it's impossible. It's like saying, can you please remove your personality? It's not going to happen. If you can reduce bias in your organization, reduce it for yourself, but also be a champion to others. So if you're on a panel interview or if you're in a dual interview with another colleague and you notice that they say something before an interview starts, like, hey, this person came from AWS, they're definitely going to know about why. pull them up on it, be a champion for other people as well, and say, hey, forget the organizations that someone's worked for. Let's ask questions that open up the wheels of that person. Let's allow that person to drop the persona, drop the shoulders, and speak about their experience before we make informed decisions as to whether they're going to be good or bad based on an organization, an educational establishment, etc. So pulling yourself up, being a champion, but also being a champion for others to remove things like biases means that everyone gets more of an equitable chance of getting through the doors than they don't.
It is my job to be a champion and an ally.
Yep.
And I would love to hear your take, and I would love for the audience to get a full take on that.
Yeah, and I said this in the last stage that I was on when I apologized that I'm speaking about or an advocate for diversity and I don't fall under any of the 15 plus categories. And someone afterwards came up and said, look, I think it's really courageous that you addressed it. I'm glad that you did, but it would have made me think nothing less given what you just delivered. And when it comes to that, I also then said, look, I'm under no pre-illusion that at points in my life, I've taken advantage of privileged white male status, and I've probably been given one or two roles. And I say given quite aggressively there. I've been given roles just because I probably look like I should be a fit to the position historically. And for those who have got me on LinkedIn or those who don't, you can add me and go through some of my posts. I post about this stuff all the time that personally I think it's disgusting. I would actually rather have been rejected from those organizations than included, because then once you're on the inside, the positive for me was that there's lots to do, because that white privileged male ethos runs throughout an organization, and it's my job to go in and uncover that, potentially help fix it. But I still think that everyone should have a seat at the table throughout every hiring process, from interviewers right through to the candidate, to be given an equitable chance to be hired into the organization. I created an interview training program when I was at AWS, and I did a lot of study. For those of you who have never seen the Frank Schmidt 100-year recruitment study, I'm more than happy to give Chris the link and he can post it out with this, but it's an incredible study of 100 years worth of recruiting. And there's little things in it that I then went, like I usually do, I went 20 levels deeper on the subjects. And it was amazing at that point in time. And this was back in 2017, 2018, technical interview. So I'll stick to the area that you also focus on with your business, Chris, and the area that I've been in for a couple of decades. In a technical interviewer will spend over 85% of any allocated time. So whether that's 30 minutes, 45, 60 minutes, 90 minutes, finding out what someone doesn't know. Now, if you then put together a 5-stage interview process and it's all an hour, think of the time that's been wasted if 90% of each of those interviews have been finding out what someone doesn't know. Or the way that I like to think about it is the reason why you shouldn't hire someone. You've given yourself 10% of the time for each interview to actually uncover what someone does know and why to hire them, which again goes back to the equitable piece. You're not giving that person a fair chance of being hired into any organization, whether it's that team, whether it's opening up the skills base and figuring out, oh, that person would actually be perfect for another team, maybe not ours right now. You're not giving someone a chance. And usually that other 10% is an introduction, a bit of chit chat, and an ending, or what are the next processes. So you've actually found out probably less than 2 or 3% of why you should hire the person. In an interview, when I was at AWS and when I was at Zip and when I was at Wipro, I tried to change the landscape of the way interviewers thought. And I call it the cab driver syndrome. A lot of interviewers say, but why do I need interview training? I've done 800. And I'm like, okay, name one cab driver you've ever been in their car that's an excellent professional level driver, other than like an entourage or something that you pay thousands for. And they're like, oh, good point. I said, look, if you do the same thing shit 800 times, you don't progressively get better at it. You progressively get worse at that thing. Yeah. Unless you fix the root cause of something, you don't get better. And interviewing is exactly like driving a cab. If you interview poorly for 1,000 times, you don't get better at it. You just get better at conversation. You don't get actually better at the interviewing itself. So I used to say to people, if you figure out from someone's resume or from looking at a profile or from whatever before an interview, or that person seems to be an expert in that, focus on that area. And I always used to say, think about when you go for lunch and you're sitting with a group of workmates. How often do you, as a techie, do you throw a little seed into the middle of the table and the table erupts and you talk for hours about that topic or that subject? Treat an interview like that. Focus on the areas that someone does know, because then you open up the person's general cognitive ability and not just the functional capability of what they've done in the past. Give them complex situations that they might not have been in before to help open up the dial. And then you're spending 90% of the interview finding out why to hire someone. Still focus on the areas they don't know, because you need to know the gaps, but spend minimal effort in those areas. And again, equitable processes don't have to be throwing in a technology that removes bias from a process by taking your name, your company names, and your educational establishment names off of a resume. It can be educating the people in your organization to also remove it by giving someone an equitable chance to stepping through the door. And as I said, it might not be in your department, but speak to other departments every day and find out what are the USPs for your department and what do you focus on technically when someone comes in, because you might pick up 4 or 5 things from an interview that was for your department that you could then pass on to someone else, as opposed to rejecting that person from the whole organization. Like, it's all of these little things that you talk about being equitable. Companies are shocking at it mostly.
Well, it's interesting on the interview side of things. With one of our clients, we found that the interviewers on the technical interviews were asking computer science theory questions, which were biased against the older folks. We looked at the people that were being rejected, and it was typically people who had been 5+ years out of college. They weren't passing because they haven't done the computer science theory courses. What I'm saying, though, is that they just haven't used it. They copy and paste stuff. They're reusing stuff that they weren't using before. Kris, this was fantastic. How and why should people get in touch with you?
I never like to give the why because I'm not a salesy person. For those who want to find me, my website is clellandsandco.com. I'm on LinkedIn profusely and consistently posting and soaking up information and being a sponge. My Chris is spelt with a K, unlike Chris Murdock. You can find me, my LinkedIn is actually Christopher, so it's my Sunday name with my surname Clelland. So people can reach out on LinkedIn. Yeah, I'm happy for anyone to reach out if they've enjoyed this, if they've got any questions. Probably more so if anyone wants to challenge me on anything, please do.